That quote cuts to something basic and uncomfortable. That human behavior doesn't need magic or mystery to go wrong. But it also says something bigger about belief, how easily we confuse our own ideas with something absolute. And nowhere is that confusion more obvious than in religion. Every major religion and a lot of minor ones believes that what it teaches is true. Not just meaningful, not just spiritually useful, but true. Objectively. Universally. Unshakably. And more than that, it believes that other religions are, in some important way, mistaken. Sometimes that's framed softly, others have part of the truth, or we all seek the same divine source. But look closer, and you'll almost always find a dividing line. A claim to authority. A story that doesn't leave room for the others to be equally valid. So the question is, why? Why does every religion believe it's the one that got it right? The answer isn't about divine revelation, though that's what most religions will claim. It's about something more familiar, more human. Identity. Story. Community. And the way belief systems evolve to survive and spread. Because religions don't start out as global doctrines. They start as local ideas. In a time. In a place. Among a group of people responding to the world around them. Maybe they're dealing with loss. Or fear. Or injustice. Or chaos. And someone says, here's what it all means. Here's the reason behind it. Here's the path forward. And that path, that system of belief, works. It brings comfort. It offers structure. It explains things. It gives people rituals and rules and hope. And over time, the story gets deeper. It gets repeated. It gets written down. It gets passed from parent to child. It becomes tradition. And eventually, it becomes the truth. But here's the part most people miss. Truth in that context doesn't just mean, this makes sense. It means, this is who we are. The belief becomes personal. Then social. Then cultural. And by the time it becomes a religion, it's not just about believing in something, it's about belonging to it. And once a belief system is tied to identity, challenging it feels like an attack. That's one reason religions claim exclusive truth, because the belief is no longer just intellectual. It's emotional, cultural, existential. But there's another reason too, one that's tied to how religions survive. A belief system that says, this is one possible path among many, doesn't spread as aggressively as one that says, this is the only path, and everyone else is lost. Exclusivity fuels growth. It creates urgency. It gives believers a reason to convert others. To protect the faith. To treat disagreement not as a curiosity, but as a threat. That's not an accident. It's evolution. Belief systems that present themselves as universal truths are more likely to get passed on. They're more likely to inspire devotion. And they're more likely to justify themselves in the face of conflict. And that's exactly what history shows us. Look at any religion with global reach, and you'll find a long record of expansion, through persuasion, yes, but also through pressure. Through colonization. Through violence. Through law. Through political alliance. Through economic incentive. And always, through the claim that, this is the truth. That claim doesn't just justify action. It erases doubt. It silences questions. It defines outsiders. And it turns belief into territory. But the strange thing is, every religion does this. Which means, by definition, they can't all be right. They contradict each other on major points: who the divine is, what it wants, how to live, what happens after death. These aren't small differences. They're central claims. So how do people inside those systems reconcile that? Most don't. They just don't think about it too deeply. Or they're taught that the contradictions are proof of deception. That other religions were corrupted. Or confused. Or inspired by darker forces. Some are taught to respect other faiths, but not to take them seriously. Because the idea that someone else's story could be true, when it contradicts your own, feels like a threat to everything you've built your life around. But there's something else happening too. Most religions are built on stories that explain the world. Not just how it works, but why it is the way it is. They answer questions that science and philosophy often leave open. Why are we here? What happens when we die? What's the meaning of suffering? Those aren't easy questions. And religions offer packaged answers. Stories with roots. Stories with emotional weight. Stories you hear as a child, from people you trust. And once those stories are embedded in you, especially if they come with rituals, holidays, community, once a story gets into your identity, it becomes more than just belief, it becomes memory, not just what you think, but how you feel, what you celebrate, where you belong. It's wired into your early experiences, your community, your childhood routines. And those emotional roots make it incredibly difficult to question. Even when the logic starts to crack, that's not a weakness. It's how the human mind works. Cognitive scientists have shown that we tend to hold on to ideas that reinforce what we already believe, and we filter out information that challenges it. This is called confirmation bias. It doesn't mean people are lying to themselves, it means their brains are doing what they're built to do, protect coherence, and when it comes to religion, that coherence runs deep, because belief doesn't stand alone. It's reinforced constantly, through repetition, through ritual, through social affirmation. The more you hear something, the more familiar it becomes. And the more familiar it becomes, the more true it feels. This is called the mere exposure effect, the tendency to prefer ideas just because we've been exposed to them more often. So when someone grows up hearing one version of truth, surrounded by people who also believe it, wrapped in music and ceremony and certainty, it stops feeling like a belief and starts feeling like a fact. And this is why two people, from two completely different religions, can feel absolutely convinced that their version is the correct one, even when those versions completely contradict each other. It's not because one of them is less sincere, it's because both have had their beliefs shaped by the same mental patterns, the same social mechanisms, the same emotional scaffolding, and in both cases, the belief feels obvious, inevitable, right, but none of that tells us whether it's actually true. What it tells us is that the human mind is good at protecting belief once it takes hold. Especially when that belief is tied to identity, family, culture, and community. And when people are confronted with another religion, one that's different, equally confident, equally old, equally complex, the response isn't usually curiosity, it's defensiveness, because accepting that someone else might be right means facing the possibility that you might be wrong. And that's not just about facts. It's about everything tied to those facts, your traditions, your loved ones, your sense of purpose. So the mind finds a way to protect the original story. It says the others are mistaken, or misled, or copying the truth imperfectly, or being tested, or missing the one key piece that only your tradition has. Every religion has its way of explaining why other religions exist, and those explanations usually preserve the original claim of being the only truth. sometimes it's done through stories, narratives where earlier belief systems were stepping stones, preparing the way for the final revelation. Other times, it's more adversarial. Other religions are portrayed as false paths, or even as tools of darkness, and once you frame competing beliefs as spiritually dangerous, you don't have to listen to them, you can dismiss them entirely. That's how belief systems preserve themselves, not just by answering questions, but by shielding themselves from being questioned. And here's where things get more complex, because not all believers are rigid. Many are open-minded, curious, thoughtful, willing to learn about other traditions, willing to question, at least a little. But even then, the idea that their belief is the ultimate truth still lingers. It's often seen as humble to say, other religions contain wisdom. But the fine print is usually, just not the whole truth. Only our version has the full picture. Only our path leads all the way home, and that's not an accident. Religions are designed to outcompete one another. Not consciously, but structurally. The ones that survived were the ones that convinced people they were indispensable. That kind of belief spreads faster. It motivates more deeply. It creates a stronger in-group. Exclusivity doesn't just protect belief, it creates boundaries. When a religion claims it's the only truth, it draws a line between those who are in and those who are out. That line can be theological, social, moral, or all three at once. And it's not just abstract. It affects how people are treated, it shapes who's trusted, who's hired, who's included in family events, who's allowed to marry into the group, who's seen as saved, and who isn't. And while many believers claim to respect other faiths, that respect often stops where doctrine begins. You can admire someone's kindness, their devotion, their traditions, but still quietly believe they're wrong about the most important thing. That tension creates awkwardness, or worse, division. Because exclusivity isn't just a belief, it becomes a social structure. It tells people where they belong, who they're allowed to fully connect with, who counts as one of us, and this isn't just about traditional religions. The same pattern shows up in new movements too. Any belief system that builds identity around the truth ends up drawing similar lines. Whether it's a revivalist movement, a self-proclaimed spiritual awakening, or a modern ideology dressed in metaphysical language, if it claims to be the ultimate path, it ends up repeating the same pattern. You can see this in how even small religious groups, ones with little global influence, often describe themselves as having unique access to truth. The chosen, the enlightened, the awakened, the remnant. The ones who see what others don't, and the more isolated or persecuted the group feels, the stronger that claim tends to become, because being in the minority doesn't always lead to humility. Sometimes it strengthens the conviction. The thinking goes, if most people disagree with us, that just proves we're on the narrow path, and that logic becomes self-reinforcing. The less popular the belief, the more it feels sacred. This is part of why religious disagreement doesn't lead to convergence. It leads to fragmentation. Branches, schisms, sects. Each one adjusting the doctrine just slightly, until it becomes its own version of the truth, but in nearly every case, that new version still believes it's the correct one. So why does this matter? Because it reveals something important, that religious truth is less about correspondence with reality, and more about coherence within a group. The belief feels true because it fits the community. Because it explains the world in a way that aligns with what you've been taught. Because it's been reinforced emotionally, socially, and psychologically. And once that internal sense of truth sets in, it becomes very hard to see belief as one option among many. It feels like the option, even when the people in the next town, or the next country, or the next building, believe something entirely different, and feel just as certain. This is why religious pluralism, the idea that many religions can coexist peacefully, is so fragile. Because even when people live peacefully, the beliefs underneath still claim supremacy, and that hidden tension, between surface tolerance and underlying exclusivity, often goes unspoken. Until it doesn't, you see it when communities resist interfaith education, when they avoid dialogue, when they discourage their children from learning too much about other traditions. Because deep down, they know too much exposure can lead to comparison, and comparison can lead to doubt, and doubt, in a system that claims to hold absolute truth, is a threat, so the structure leans toward protection, toward certainty, toward insulation. It teaches that to question too much is dangerous. That quiet separation, the one people don't always talk about, affects more than just belief. It shapes politics, education, relationships, even global conflict. When two groups both believe they have the only real truth, not just a viewpoint, but the truth, compromise becomes hard. Conversation turns into conversion. Curiosity gets replaced with caution. And cooperation, even when it's possible, always carries tension underneath. You see this in families, when members marry outside the faith and others feel like something sacred is being broken. You see it in schools, where communities debate over whose beliefs should be reflected in the curriculum, the holidays, the prayer spaces. You see it in laws, where deeply held convictions are used to justify policies, not because they're logical or fair, but because they're tied to what someone believes God wants. And most of all, you see it in conflict, when religion becomes part of national identity, and disagreement turns into division. This isn't because religion itself is violent. It's because exclusivity, especially moral or metaphysical exclusivity, makes disagreement feel like danger, because if you are right, truly right, and someone else claims something different, then either you're wrong, or they are. And if you believe your truth is sacred, even required for salvation, then protecting it feels urgent. That urgency leads to pressure, persuasion, isolation, sometimes even force. But again, this isn't unique to any one religion. It's the pattern. It's what happens when belief becomes fused with identity, and identity is treated as absolute. It's the same pattern that makes people confuse what's familiar with what's true, because human minds aren't objective machines. We're built to make sense of the world through patterns, through stories, through the things we already know. And what we already know always feels more solid than what we don't, so the version of truth that you hear first, from people you trust, wrapped in emotion and meaning and ritual, is always going to feel more real than something you hear later, even if the facts are stronger. That's not stupidity. That's psychology, and when a belief system reinforces that psychology with sacred language, eternal consequences, and a community that all agrees, you get something that feels so true, it doesn't even feel like belief anymore. It just feels like reality. That's the trap, because every religion builds that structure. Every religion surrounds its followers with familiarity, repetition, and emotion. Every religion uses story, ritual, and identity to reinforce belief. And every religion teaches that other religions, while maybe sincere, are still wrong in some ultimate way, and if all of them are using the same methods to arrive at different conclusions, maybe the conclusion isn't the strongest part, maybe the method is just good at making things feel true. That's not to say that people's experiences aren't real, or that their moments of meaning don't matter. But meaning is not the same as proof. And comfort is not the same as truth. What people feel inside their tradition may be powerful, but people in other traditions feel just as strongly, and they can't all be right. Certainty feels good. It offers safety, stability, direction. When you think you know the truth, the real, ultimate, unquestionable truth, you don't have to wrestle with complexity. You don't have to wonder if you're missing something. You just follow the path you've been given. That kind of certainty is tempting. Especially when life is hard. When the world feels chaotic. When people want something solid to hold on to, but the question is never just, does this feel good? The question is it true? And that's where honesty starts to matter, because when every religion claims to be the only truth, and all of them use the same psychological and social tools to reinforce their claims, it tells you something important. That the sense of certainty itself might not be a sign of truth, but a byproduct of the system. That doesn't mean everyone is lying. Most people aren't. They believe what they believe sincerely. Their experiences feel real. Their emotions are valid. But sincerity doesn't equal accuracy, and this is the part that gets uncomfortable, because if two people feel equally certain, but believe contradictory things, someone has to be wrong. Maybe both. And if your certainty is based on how deeply you feel it, you've just created a system where feelings define facts. That's not a path to truth. It's a path to tribalism, and that's what we see play out again and again, across time, across cultures, across every major religion, people convinced that their view is the one real truth. Even when others, with equal depth and devotion, believe something entirely different. Even when the core claims conflict. Even when the moral teachings contradict. Even when the origin stories don't match up, and the reason that continues is simple, because these beliefs aren't just ideas, they're identities. And identities resist change, but stepping back from that doesn't mean giving up on meaning. It doesn't mean abandoning ethics or purpose or community. It just means being honest about where those things come from. They don't have to be handed down from above to matter, they don't need to be wrapped in eternal truth to shape a good life, and they don't need to come with a claim that everyone else is wrong. Letting go of exclusive truth claims opens the door to something more grounded, and more human, a way of living where meaning is chosen, not assigned. Where compassion doesn't depend on conformity. Where disagreement isn't danger, and doubt isn't weakness. It doesn't mean every belief is equally valid. But it means we stop pretending that belief, on its own, is a measure of truth. It means recognizing that every religion thinks it's right, not because it is right, but because it's using the same methods that make any story feel true. And when you understand that, really understand it, certainty starts to lose its grip, and clarity takes its place. Not the kind of clarity that comes from knowing all the answers, but the kind that comes from finally being honest about the questions.